You look at monolithic chains, they're certainly not going anywhere. There's a lot of network effects around monolithic chains, and this is due primarily to the monetary premium like those tokens are able to achieve. This is something the Cosmos Hub token, for example, has never achieved, right? There's never been a monetary premium for Atom because it's not like the base layer, fat protocol thesis where everything's settling on top of it, and it's not like one particular token that the entire community is coalescing around.
The Appchain Thesis is the freedom thesis, where every ecosystem, every appchain has its own sovereignty, which means you will have your own ideology, you will have your own community, and you will have own innovation and technology.
Welcome to the Interop. I'm here today with Eric Zhang, who's the founder of DoraHacks, and Brian Breslow, who is in business development and venture at DoraHacks, Dora Ventures. DoraHacks is a leading developer incentive platform focusing on developer ecosystems, and they're funding hackers primarily through hackathons, grant programs, etc. And they're working on a new L1 called Dora Vota that is going to improving the way we fund open source projects and public goods. Before we get started, be sure to subscribe to get notified when new episodes drop every week. And remember, none of what we discuss here on the Interop is investment advice. And if you enjoy this content, please consider sticking with us. Just look for Interop in the active set. Hey guys, thanks for joining me.
Thanks, Seb. Thanks for having us. Really appreciate being here.
Thank you, Seb.
So DoraHacks has been in the space for quite some time, and I think a lot of people know DoraHacks as a team that organizes hackathons and helps fund projects in the ecosystem. But as I've learned recently through talking to you guys, it's so much more than that. You have this venture arm, you're organizing events, and you're also building this L1 that I think is really interesting because it sort of pushes the frontiers of blockchain voting. So yeah, how did Dora get started, and what was the thesis for DoraHacks?
Yeah, so thank you, Seb, for having us. I think DoraHacks started almost 10 years ago. It was a very small organization. It was the era of student hackathon and the initial phase of the hackathon movement, where you could see very big hackathons in different US universities and gradually spread it out to Europe and UK and some other Asian countries. So the hackathons at that time was organized mostly by students once a year or twice a year, super big, and mostly sponsored by very big Web2 companies. And students attending those hackathons, they wanted to find jobs mostly, and those companies will be sponsoring this kind of hackathon. And the idea of DoraHacks was quite different from this idea, which was organizing very small hackathons, but very frequent hackathons, every week. If we can organize 2 or 3 hackathons in different places, but much smaller, so that whenever people wanted to join, they could join a hackathon at DoraHacks. So that was the very first idea of DoraHacks. And gradually there was a merge of the Web3 movement and the hacker movement, right? Because mostly in Web3 and blockchain technology, 99% of the technology is open source. And obviously that is very friendly to the developer community. So everyone could just build on top of other people's work, given that they comply to the open source licensings. So it's a completely different thing. So it was very natural that DoraHacks became a global hackathon organizer in Web3, and later we decided to. So in the first few years, we organized hundreds of hackathons in different cities in the world, which was a very amazing experience. But we wanted to enable more communities, more organizations to host different types of hackathons. So that's why we started to develop the platform DoraHacks.io that you could see now. And Hackathon is like the basic feature of that platform, but on top of that, we have so many things that could be added, like quadratic funding, like bounties, like ideas, and many other interesting features. And the idea of the platform is then to allow any open source communities or hackathon organizers to host their own hackathons and enable their own community to innovate around open source technology.
And at which point did DoraHacks shift from early sort of like Web 2 and into or like early crypto and Web 3?
I think that was around 2015. So we
Okay, so
started
it's pretty
in
early.
2014. In 2015, we hosted hackathons in different topics, and I remember that there were like fintech and data tech-related hackathons. But what we observed was that like half of the hackers were building blockchain technology at that time,
Right.
and then it was pretty obvious that the movement was towards the blockchain technology. But at that time, there was no term called Web3. So people were talking about Ethereum, people were talking about Bitcoin, smart contract. And in 2016, we had like ENS, and people were building like algorithms to beat ENS domains. So like there were a lot of interesting developer teams back then already. But in 2017, there was a big boom in the blockchain community. Obviously, mostly because of the bull market, and we were able to host a huge number of hackathons in different cities in the world.
That's impressive. I didn't realize that DoraHacks had been around for so long, and that you guys had gotten your start like very, very early in the space. So what are the different things that DoraHacks are involved in today? Obviously, there's the hackathons. You guys have like a venture arm. Like what are all the different sort of facets of DoraHacks that people might not be familiar with?
I'll just try to package it together real quick too, and Eric definitely jump in as well. I think it's kind of interesting, like how everything kind of builds up on each other in terms of what we're trying to do, which is ultimately support the everlasting hacker movement. So DoraHacks is obviously a platform to bring hackers together and create this decentralized community of developers that are going to be participating in different community hackathons at a global scale, because most of what we do is virtual. And obviously the platform has a lot of features that enable different ecosystems to incentivize developer activations, right? As Eric mentioned, hackathons, grants, quadratic funding opportunities, etc. So this is the platform that we've created. And what extends this platform is some of the infrastructure incubations we have, like Dora Factory, which is enabling on-chain infrastructure to better facilitate this global movement of hackers, right? This is on-chain tooling related to decentralized governance that we can get into, quadratic funding modules, as Eric mentioned, rewards mechanisms for sustainable funding of ecosystems. This is something we call public good staking that we can talk to. And then it also culminates most recently with the rise of Dora Ventures, which is a way for us to also participate in the upside of these communities that we are curating, right? It almost makes sense to want to be able to capitalize the most promising teams and developers that are emerging organically from this platform to provide them continuation funding so that they can reach full production, and also allows us to like grow ourselves and benefit from the community resources that we're instilling, at a very early level. So it's kind of like basically you can look at it like a couple, like all of these different toolings and infrastructures and capital formation tools we have that allows developer communities to grow from a very early stage, and also provide them resources to sustainably survive long term once they've gotten larger. So I don't know, Eric, if there's anything you'd want to add to that.
I think like all of the products we're building are really centered around the vision of advancing the hacker movement. So obviously, like DoraHacks is a platform, but behind this platform, we need some other infrastructures that we can use to support the movement. So one thing we care about is how we can sustainably fund the open source developers, the communities, the hackathon organizers. And the other thing is, if we have funding, right, how can we distribute this funding in a decentralized setting? That's going to be very different from the traditional world. So more advanced governance technology will definitely enable other things, make it more fair and also make it more efficient. So those are the things Dora Factory is building.
Cool. Yeah, I definitely want to talk about the governance aspect here a little bit later on. But I think I'd like to start maybe with a topic that we're all very passionate about, which is the Appchain Thesis. And I know that this is something that like DoraHacks has been interested in, invested in, and certainly like you guys are organizing this Appchain Day conference as well. Like I was at your Appchain Day in Denver. It was really great. And so you guys started investing in Cosmos pretty early, I think. And what was the prevailing thesis there in terms of how blockchains were going to scale? There were a lot of different views at that point, I think, early on, like in 2017, 2018, about how blockchains would scale. You had the Ethereums of the world, really pushing for this more monolithic idea of scaling. And then sort of Cosmos and Polkadot came around and had a much different view that chains would scale by becoming sovereign and introducing interoperability between them. What about that made sense, and how do you think that has translated into how we're thinking about scaling today?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And I guess I'll preface it by saying, just because we are very much proponents of the Appchain thesis, that doesn't mean that we don't like monolithic ecosystems, right? Our goal is to support developers. Ultimately, that's our highest and most important goal, is to support this everlasting hacker movement. But of course, from an area of us wanting to get involved more, app chains and the multi-chain is really where we play and spend a lot of our time. And you should think about that quite naturally, right? As a hackathon platform, and just hackathons in general, right? They're very important for the long tail of communities. It's very natural for hackathons to occur in early stage ecosystems that are looking to bootstrap their developers and grow adoption of their tech stacks. So just by the nature of what hackathons are and what they're important for, you end up covering a lot of the long tail of assets. And this originally is how we started getting involved more with some of these new Cosmos chains and new app chains that were new but didn't have the existing developer communities that some of the large monolithic chains had. So I think our experience and our bullishness actually developed from an initial point of actually starting to get involved in those developer communities and seeing what they needed to grow. Now, when you look at monolithic chains, they're certainly not going anywhere. There's a lot of network effects around monolithic chains, and this is due primarily to the monetary premium those tokens are able to achieve. This is something the Cosmos Hub token, for example, has never achieved, right? There's never been a monetary premium for Atom because it's not the base layer, fat protocol thesis where everything's settling on top of it. And it's not one particular token that the entire community is coalescing around, right? When you look at Ethereum ecosystem, everyone is coalesced around ETH. This basically helps it maintain a monetary premium. And because of this, there's a lot of network effects around these ecosystems. That's why original monolithic chains, even things like Bitcoin Cash, ETH Classic, Bitcoin SV, these are not very active developer ecosystems anymore, but they're still ranked top 100, top 200, in market cap, just because once they get these network effects and establish this monetary premium, it's very hard for them to go away. So I think that like a level of monolithic chains will always prevail and like be relevant to a certain extent, especially ones that have very large developer ecosystems like Solana. But in terms of like where we see a lot of upside and we see a lot of change in the market is app chains in general. We think that it's a bottom up movement where developers actually are demanding the ability to sell their own block space because of the benefits it creates for their project. For example, DYDX went through a very long transition period of figuring out what architecture they wanted to use. Originally, they were an application on Ethereum, just a dApp. Then they were a rollup using Starknet, and then now with V4, they're their own sovereign app chain on Cosmos SDK. This is a very common story you hear. Once an application reaches sufficient size in terms of its user base and the amount of liquidity it has, it's very common and natural for them to want to transition to their own app chain because this can lead to benefits in sovereignty. They're not held hostage by the Ethereum roadmap anymore, for example, right? Like they have their own roadmap and a lot more freedom to do what they want. They have governance sovereignty as well. That's kind of tied to roadmap, but they can bootstrap their own governance needs and create a more robust, participative community that way. There's also the ability to drive additional value to their token. For example, in DYDX, you stake DYDX to partake in fees generated by the protocol. So the validators of the network are staking the protocol's token directly. This is something that, for example, doesn't happen in Uniswap, right? The validator, the stakers of Ethereum and the people that are benefiting from the fees that Uniswap is generating, obviously, and when I say fees, I'm talking about MEV opportunities, protocol fees, gas fees, etc. These are all going to Ethereum stakers, not Uniswap token holders. So I think a big advantage of becoming your own app chain is the ability to drive additional utility and value to your token. And then finally, there's a wide range of UX improvements you can make as well, related to gasless transactions, like embedded wallets. When you have dedicated block space, oftentimes the application can be faster, lower latency, these types of things. From my opinion, I don't really think this thesis is arising due to a need. Maybe originally the first L2s came about because gas prices on Ethereum were so exorbitantly high that we needed a scaling solution. But at this stage in the cycle, I think that the continued success and growth of app chains and other modular architectures in general, whether that's an L2 or rollup, are actually stemming from the fact that developers themselves are demanding this architecture because they prefer to develop on it, and they want to pivot their applications to it, regardless of scaling needs.
Yeah, I'm reminded of this this Dan Elitzer article from 2022, the Nascent Capital partner who wrote this article about the inevitability of Unichain and basically describes, all of the benefits that you just went through. And it just made so much sense to me that applications would want to be sovereign from the perspective of execution, but also from the security of their chain. And that sort of resonated with me in terms of how I saw app chains overtaking applications on monolithic chains. But it seems like now we're landing kind of somewhere in the middle where, the Cosmos Appchain Thesis that every chain has its own validator set, every chain is sovereign from top to bottom, makes sense for some chains, obviously, like DYDX, I think, is one of those examples. I was just talking to the Mantra team today. And maybe at some point Uniswap also does their own chain. But at the same time, there is this in between, right? There is this growing number of chains that are being built on someone else's security. Actually, I'm kind of reminded of the, of the cloud, whereas, the cloud is just you're just using someone else's someone else's computer. L2s and AppChains secured by shared security systems also kind of fall within that same idea, I think. What is your thought? Is you mentioned L2s. I think I've heard you speak on some other venues talking about L2s are not actually for scaling, but they're more about building an ecosystem and capturing developer attention. What's your thesis there for L2s?
I think it's all semantics that are obfuscating the underlying trend of developers wanting to sell their own sovereign block space. In my opinion, that's what underpins the modular/Appchain thesis in general. I view it as like a triangle of trade-offs that you can make, right? Between like how much sovereignty you want, how much security you want, how much liquidity alignment you want for major ecosystems, right? There's all of these trade-offs you can make along like the sovereignty / like shared security axis, right? And that depending on like what you're optimizing for might like direct your choice of whether you're launching, your own sovereign app chain with your own sequence, with your own validators using the Cosmos SDK, or if you're launching, your project as an app-specific rollup, using the OP stack or Arbitrum Nitro or some other rollup framework. But in general, like I think it's all the same thing. To be quite frank, I think it's all like regardless. Like I would view OP Stack, Arbitrum Nitro, Cosmos SDK, Hyper SDK, which is developed by Ava Labs, Substrate, Polkadot. Like I view it all as like these are all just like competing AppChain frameworks, in my opinion. They all come with pros and cons. They all come with like different things that are part of the stack. Some have native interop, some don't have native interop. Some have customizability at like a very granular level in terms of like being able to customize like block speed and block times. Some don't. Some have governance modules built in, some don't. So there's all of these different trade-offs you can think about in terms of like what you're particularly optimizing for. But in my opinion, it's all the trend is we're seeing top applications with existing liquidity, sizable communities wanting to pivot to their own app chain infrastructure to sell their own block space. Because block space is really one of the things in Web3 that really has product market fit. It is like quite obviously a valuable resource. If you're an application that doesn't have existing liquidity, but you want like the benefits of sovereignty, or you want the ability to sell your own block space, maybe you're looking into an L2 architecture like the OP stack because you can draft off of like Ethereum mainnet liquidity. But if you're a major application like DYDX that already has a lot of users, they're more comfortable taking the leap into their very own sovereign L1. But at the end of the day, like it's all the same thing. I think we'll see what framework is most successful in the long term. We obviously have our opinions as well, but I think that that's kind of the lay of the land as I see it.
I do have a different opinion though.
Sure.
So I think one of the biggest reasons why we care about Cosmos SDK is because I think for developers, it's critical to think about like whether your application needs to, submit some attestation to the L1, and then there is a big difference between the Cosmos SDK chains versus the layer 2 chains, whether that's a Ethereum layer 2 or other monolithic L1's layer 2. I do think it makes sense for some of the applications to submit attestations to L1s. For example, like there are so if you are a Ethereum L2 and you're bridging some Ethereum assets to your L2 for trading or other type of purposes, you have to submit a proof to Ethereum, whether that's a ZK proof or fraud proof, whatever that is necessary, right? If, for example, you are doing a content protocol, you might want to attest your content on Bitcoin or other chains, like Aptos or even newer chains. However, like there is a wide range of applications that do not actually need to submit any proof to any L1s. And that's where these developers can build sovereign options. I think by sovereignty, we do mean that you're not paying gas fee regularly to the L1, and I think that's making a big difference to Cosmos SDK, because that is probably the only framework you can easily and reliably build up your sovereign app chain for your application. So in general, I think both monolithic thesis and the Appchain thesis will coexist, but the worldview of the Appchain thesis, in the worldview, the monolithic chains are eventually app chains, right? So they are like larger app chains, but the Appchain thesis is the freedom thesis, where every ecosystem, every app chain has its own sovereignty, which means you will have your own ideology, you will have your own community, and you will have your own innovation and technology, etc. So that is in contrast to a world where you only have a very handful of monolithic chains, because then as a user or as a developer, your options will be very limited. You'll have very limited option for example, ideology or culture, like what kind of culture the community is having, something like that. So for us, the Appchain thesis is all about the worldview of providing more options and freedom to the users and to the developers.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. I think maybe just one thing I would say here, you mentioned that the main thing that you get by running your own app chain is that you don't have to pay for block space. I think it's more than that. I think there's also if you're looking at the Cosmos SDK, for instance, there's the ability to also capture MEV. There's the ability to now run your own Oracle on chain and leverage your validator set. There is the ability to leverage different execution environments, perhaps even multiple execution environments on the same chain. So I think that the Appchain thesis is security sovereignty, but it's also execution sovereignty, and we're seeing more and more chains leverage things like Slinky for skips Slinky to be able to utilize their validator set to run oracles. Now, to what extent you can do that, I think for the oracles, for instance, you do need a validator set to do that. But if you're running some sort of an L2 or some sort of a application-specific roll-up, then you can certainly be a little bit more flexible in terms of leveraging any VM that you like, or implementing sort of specific logic in terms of sequencing. So yeah, like the sovereignty gradient, I think you move along the sovereignty scope or spectrum as you increase your add a validator set, and now with things like roll chains, where you can not only leverage a validator set but also leverage the security of Celestia or underlying DA layers, we introduce a whole new paradigm, I think, of ways people are going to be thinking about running their own chains and how they think about securing those chains.
I think what you're describing, Seb, is actually exactly why alt VMs and things like the Solana Appchain thesis have begun to grow, right? It's exactly what you just mentioned, which is freedom of execution, right? The modular thesis doesn't just mean your chain's modular. It means that there's modular components that can be quickly snapped together and picked and chosen from, right? So what you just described of the Cosmos SDK, for example, creating this amazing ability to have execution sovereignty, that was originally our thesis behind why we might start seeing the SVM become a big player in the Appchain thesis as well, right? There's a lot of benefits to this execution layer, this isolated execution layer, outside of just the pure performance of the Solana mainnet, right? And this is the case with a lot of alt VMs, right? Solana in particular, you have compression, you have local fee markets, you have parallel transactions. These are all things that are beneficial regardless of how fast the chain is. Obviously, parallel transactions can add to speed, but these are just things that are good for throughput generally, and that can be beneficial for many different types of applications in general. regardless of what the underlying framework is. So I think what you just
Yeah.
described is a big part of how we see the space evolving as well.
Yeah, I want to talk about Solana, but before that, I want to talk about the hub because sort of the elephant in the room here when we talk about Cosmos AppChains. And I think broadly there's just this like Cosmos identity crisis that has been going on for some time. It feels like Cosmos is going through a shift where the Cosmos SDK technology is beginning to decouple from the Cosmos ecosystem as we've known it until now. You know, the 60 or so app chains that use the Cosmos SDK, that have their own validator sets, that are connected in the IBC ecosystem. Can you share your vision for what Cosmos is or should be in the coming years? As you know, we have things like now the Cosmos SDK being used in EigenLayer and being secured by restaked ETH or restaked Bitcoin, or components of other components of the stack like IBC being used in the movement ecosystem, totally outside of the scope of the Cosmos SDK. You know, what's beyond Cosmos from the perspective of how we've known Cosmos until now?
Yeah, I think this is the billion-dollar question for the hub, but also for the whole ecosystem. So I think many of the blockchain applications will need an app chain as a platform so that you can host your application. So maybe some of the projects will develop modules or like additional protocol nodes. Some of the actions will be more Cosmos driven. For example, Dora Vota is a more like smart contract driven app chain, but like Celestia, just because of its architecture, is like building additional layer on top of the Cosmos SDK as well. Yeah, so but for the SDK, I think the biggest strength is that it's open source. It's totally free to use. It doesn't charge anything, right? So anyone can just use it for free, and there is no mandate that you have to pay gas fee to the hub. You don't have to pay for anything. Like there is a dilemma. So the benefit of that is obviously it truly empowers the action ecosystem. I think this is the biggest strength. So we can see DYDX, we can see Injective, and there's so many cool technologies and actions being built on top of Cosmos SDK. And the downside of that is the token is not capturing value. So I think that's the problem that is being discussed within the community. And obviously, there are a lot of interesting experiments, like the shared security experiment and the currently ongoing partial security experiment. So I think like monetization of the hub or monetization of the Cosmos SDK would definitely be a very interesting and important question, both for the SDK and also for the hub. And any kind of experiment from the community should be welcome. But personally, I feel like the biggest strength of Cosmos SDK is that it's open source, it's free, and it provides freedom. So we should keep it so. And maybe we should think about, for example, like inventing some new kind of open source licensing protocol or some like on-chain enforced open source license so that the app chains using Cosmos SDK can subscribe to the open source license. Let's say there is a paid open source license that you can subscribe to, but only after your app chain is post PMF. So if you have a definition of like an app chain PMF and and you can subscribe to this open source license. It's going to be very consistent with the Cosmos SDK core value. But obviously, so that is just a thought right now. But I think something that worth exploring should be consistent with the core value Cosmos SDK is providing.
Yeah, as a perpetual Atom holder, I'm always just holding out for that value accrual to the hub, that it will one day come. Yeah, I think these you sort of hit the nail on the head here, where we've had several experiments on the hub, and those experiments until now have not been successful in accruing value to Atom. And I think that one of the issues here is that they always seem to be sort of experiments with a lack of real direction, resources, and organizationally, just like things like business development, etc., are lacking. I think Informal is now taking more of a lead on the hub, but obviously, like, they're competent. They have people who really understand the tech and understand the ecosystem, but the experimentation attempts are numbered. I think that the hub has, I think Zaki had said this last year, right? It was like the hub has 18 months to find product market fit. That was almost a year ago. So I guess it has 6 months now.
Yeah.
Or maybe it was 24 months. But yeah, the clock's ticking, and I think it's ticking primarily because there's just like so much more competition now and so many more shiny things that new people in the space are discovering and looking towards in terms of a way to build their application specific chains, or even chains secured by Restake ETH or Bitcoin or Solana, etc. So there's a lot more competition now than there was 2 years ago, and so yeah, but still staking Atom for some reason. Yeah, so I know you guys are pretty deep in the Solana ecosystem, and I was watching one of your presentations earlier, and there's this term that keeps coming up, and it's just like every time I hear it, my brain just can't comprehend it, which is like Solana Appchain or Solana L2, and I think the reason why is because Solana's entire MO and vision has been this monolithic chain where everything settles to that chain, all the applications are composable, and it scales. Now Solana is often down or over congested, and so I think they still have some issues there, but at least in terms of Solana's vision, like putting Solana and L2 together sort of it feels to me like an oxymoron. Can you maybe help us unpack what is the Solana Appchain thesis, and why would someone want to build an app chain on Solana?
From my side, I personally think that's very questionable, but obviously Brian has been doing a lot of research into that part, so Brian can share a little bit more.
Yeah, I think Eric's like actually totally correct. I mean, like, we've gotten to a point now. So this is kind of how it worked. Like, when we have supported Solana ecosystem on hackathons for a long time. Recently on the developer side of things, like, while we still want to be active, we've prioritized like more modular ecosystems, particularly like Cosmos, as you know, but definitely have kept tabs just on research, like as part of like, our job as proponents of this Appchain thesis. So when it comes to Solana, like, when we first started to think that maybe there was something there, probably about 18 months ago, where when we first, like, this was probably around the time where Maker like first made their new chain announcement, basically when they said, hey, we're like, Maker DAO is interested in launching their own app chain using the SVM. That was a pretty big deal. It caused like kind of a ruckus in the community as well. But basically what it signaled was that the SVM might be a competitive AppChain framework for applications looking to become more sovereign. And at that point in time, like the Solana AppChain world was like still pretty small. And also this is underpinned by my personal opinion that regardless of your architecture, rollup, sidechain, AppChain, it's all the same thing. So that was like, was also the lens that I was looking at Solana, right? Because at that point in time, you had like rumors of new chain from Maker. You had existing Solana app chains that basically were just a fork of the L1 code base, like Pith with PithNet, Cube Exchange, which is a new DEX on Solana that calls themselves a side chain, but like once again, like I view that as an app chain because they're selling sovereign block space. That they also forked the L1 code base. You had participants like Eclipse and Nitro working on modular SVM implementations for L2s on Ethereum. And you even had like some more like controlled thought experiments like Magic Block, which is a protocol on Solana for launching ephemeral rollups. This was probably one of the first projects where even like monolithic maxis were like, oh, okay, like maybe that makes sense. And the reason for that is because it had a gaming perspective, right? Their whole thing was like, if you're playing on-chain games, there's a lot of state that these things throw off. Like if you think about like a RPG game or like a Call of Duty, like first-person shooter, there's a lot of random state that gets thrown off during like different rounds or matches that isn't necessarily crucial to be stored in perpetuity at the base layer. So what you can do is actually per round, right? You can spin up an ephemeral rollup, and then the only data that gets sent back to Solana mainnet is like the important metrics of the game, like who won, how many kills did you have, what was your kill death ratio, what things like this, what level are you? Like this is the important stuff that needs to get stored, but a lot of the random state can just disappear. So they had this ephemeral gaming framework for rollups on Solana. And that was pretty interesting. And that's a use case that's actually a scaling use case, right? To preserving state on mainnet. Like you don't need to save this on Solana mainnet. You're better off doing it this way. But then there's also like the aspect of it where we just think that there's a lot of advantages or potential advantages to the SVM. And I'm not saying advantages like relative to other frameworks. I'm just saying like these are advantages that any given developer could like. Things I mentioned earlier, like compression, local fee markets, parallel transactions, and then just like the Rust-based like Anchor framework as well. Like Solana has an existing developer community that likes coding in this language and likes coding, using Solana frameworks where it could be advantageous to port this execution layer onto other underlying infrastructures like the Cosmos SDK even, for example. So we were really excited at it from that perspective. What if you had you already have Cosmos SDK chains with CosmWasm as the VM. You have Cosmos SDK chains with EVM. Like it makes sense that you might see Cosmos SDK chains with the SVM as its execution layer as well. And I think that's originally why we got excited in the thesis from an early stage, where it's like we will see the SVM as an isolated execution layer sooner rather than later. And I think that that's starting to prove true. The Solana Appchain Thesis has ballooned. It's probably gotten a little ahead of itself as well at this point, as like it just becomes like a popular go-to-market for fundraising. But needless to say, I do think that ultimately, like without spending too much time on it and without getting too deep in the weeds, I think ultimately what I think is important is an open source isolated SVM framework, similar to Ethermint or Polaris or CosmWasm. This is a VM that anyone can use and plug into a L1 blockchain. So I think I want to see that get developed. There's a lot of teams working on it right now, including Solana Labs, which is rebranded as Anza. They are releasing their own iteration of it. This is something that I personally am most excited about. But yeah, a lot of like I'm launching an SVM L2 on Bitcoin, or I'm launching an SVM L2 ZK SVM L2 or whatever. Like there's definitely a lot of like vapor out there, probably. But I think that like people are getting more excited about it. And, regardless of whether or not all of these SVM L2s are successful, what it did do was force, as I mentioned, Solana Labs to actually roll their own modular implementation of the SVM. So I would look at that as like a huge win. And I think that's like the core takeaway from this whole exercise is that even if like all of these SVM L2s aren't successful or, a lot of them are not needed, What it did do was drive attention to SVM as an execution layer, and it forced the hand of labs team to actually build their own version of it. And I think that's a benefit to developers.
Yeah, I think like the more execution environments we have, the better. As we have more execution environments in the ecosystem, that brings different and sort of various types of developers that are going to be looking for specific features that might be coming from different languages or different sort of like Web 2 ecosystems. They will serve different types of applications and use cases that developers will, either want to associate with one VM or another, just like how in Web 2 we have like different languages that early on sort of competed, and now we have like a landscape of like several development frameworks there. Many of those have disappeared, but in the end, I think like we have a much richer ecosystem of development frameworks as a result, and I really encourage that in Web 2 in Web 3 as well. So I'd like to switch gears and talk about Dora Vota and Dora Factory. How did this project come about, and what's the thesis?
All right. Yeah, so Dora Factory was built a lot later than DoraHacks. It was in 2021. And at that time, there were, in general, two problems from the open source communities and hackathon communities. One, given the scale that we were funding the open source developers, it was very much affected by cycles. Like in the bull market, there will be a lot of funding, and in the bear markets, there will be like the developers will be poorly funded. So we were always thinking about a way to just mitigate that, because the developer funding should be exactly opposite to that, right? So in the bear market, developers should be more incentivized to build, and in the bull market, obviously there will be a lot of money, and developers, like good developers, will always be funded. So whether we could have a super sustainable way of open source funding and hackathon funding, or like was always a top priority of our team. And we were thinking about, because in Web3, the special property of a blockchain is that it's generating value over time, and it's generating value based on the activity of the ecosystem. So let's say you have an infrastructure, you have a protocol. So like you have a bunch of applications on top of that. The more these applications will be used, the more value this infrastructure will create. So the very first idea was during a discussion over MACI. Actually, we were talking about, okay, so why not we create a super objective kind of developer funding mechanism, so that we can move towards the like block incentive driven developer funding. So in the very first place, we were thinking about like modifying some of the blockchain consensus algorithms so that they disperse 1% of their transaction revenue to a funding pool, where we could just like run constant QI for other type of events like hackathons. But obviously that was very hard. We wrote an article about that, but very soon we were thinking about a practical solution to that problem, right? So how could we achieve the same goal without modifying the underlying consensus algorithm? And that's how public good staking came out. So the idea is that Dora Factory maintains and hosts the validator to first increase the security of the network, secondly participate in governance, and then we use a large portion of the income from that validator to support the open source developer communities. So that's where public good staking originally was conceived. And the implementation took a bit longer. I think we started in 2021, and we actually implemented the whole mechanism in 2022. And definitely that is now a very well received model in the whole industry. I think more than like 50 chains have or previously adopted PGS. So that's one thing Dora Factory is doing. And the other thing is the kind of obvious, right? So now you have funding, how you could distribute this funding effectively and efficiently, because that's making a very big difference. Let's say you have 100 mil to distribute over a year, and if you can improve the efficiency by a factor of 2, the outcome will be very different. So we care about governance technology, we care about distributing the funding very efficiently. We decided to build Dora Vota and deploy most of our DGov tools and protocols on Dora Vota, partially because we can continuously improve the infrastructure instead of just improving the smart contracts, and also partially because through Dora Vota we can provide these technologies to all of the Appchain ecosystem, because we can just use IBC, and with that we can do QF, we can do, for example, community voting with a lot of the ecosystems. So public good staking and the decentralized governance tech stack are the two main things of Dora Factory.
Okay, and you guys use this MACI voting. So Brian, we had an opportunity to talk about this in Hong Kong a couple of weeks ago, and can you explain what is MACI voting, how it relates to quadratic funding, and now there's this like anonymous MACI voting, like this aMACI. So like help us unpack all of these interesting kind of like voting mechanisms that Dora Vota is implementing.
The original idea of MACI was proposed in the Ethereum forum by Vitalik several years ago, and it's a very simple but powerful framework for anti-collusion purposes. So it's not necessarily like only for voting, but voting is definitely the biggest use case for MACI. So for those who haven't come across MACI, it stands for Minimal Anti-Collusion Infrastructure. So the process of MACI is quite simple. You have an operator who is like the administrator of a voting round, and you have voters. So the voters will register to this round by a function called sign up, and after that, they can cast their vote on chain, but their votes will be encrypted with the public key posted by the operator. So that means, imagine you're in a decentralized setting, right? So like you have people from everywhere in the world, and everyone is like posting encrypted messages on chain. People cannot figure out who voted for what, because the messages will be encrypted. And then the operator will download all of the votes after the round and decrypt the votes and tally the votes. And lastly, the operator will post the final results. For example, in DoraHacks case, we have a lot of grants, and the final results will be in the form of a leaderboard. But it can also happen in elections or in other type of voting. So the results will be posted by the operator. And in order to prove the integrity of these results, the operator will post a zero knowledge proof that is proving this result is authentic. So then we have the leaderboard, or we have the final results without telling or revealing who voted for what, but people know that the leaderboard is true. So that's basically what MACI is doing. It's very simple and it's very useful.
Cool. So what are the use cases here? I mean, obviously, there's the whole kind of like grant funding and open source funding use case. But if we take a step back here and see Dora Vota as more of a, a generalized voting platform, what other use cases, like how does this extend out into maybe things outside of crypto that could be useful?
Yeah, so I think the reason why anti-collusion or collusion resistance is important is because in decentralized governance, this is a major problem for scaling. So think about quadratic funding, right? So if you're running a quadratic funding round, over the years we have been handling a lot of the problems from quadratic funding. Like there is a problem of Sybil attacks, like how you avoid that, and there is a problem of like unfair distribution. Like how can we make sure that so there are like projects with huge communities, but maybe they are not the ones that actually need the most funding. So there are a lot of practical concerns of quadratic funding, and we were able to address most of them. But the problem of collusion is really the elephant in the room, right? So it's there. If you don't care about that, then the voting schemes cannot scale, whether that's quadratic funding, quadratic voting, or a different type of community governance. So it's not gonna scale. So I say if there is a governance proposal out there for any chain, including the hub, right, and some big whale could influence the outcome by saying, okay, so if you vote for this option, I'm going to airdrop tokens to you. That's kind of easy for whales. But how do we avoid that? So that is the most tricky problem in decentralized governance, which is collusion, and this problem can only be solved by privacy. And the way we provide privacy is to use zero knowledge proof. And that's why we care about MACI. And we started to research and engineer MACI from late 2020. And I think by that time there were like two groups of people doing MACI. I think the PSE was creating a framework of MACI 1.0, which was super helpful to developers, and we were working with East Denver, and we integrated MACI with DoraHacks, and East Denver became the first like medium scale community adopting MACI, and it was pretty exciting because like East Denver 2022 had 15,000 people, and it has the big Spork community. So we allowed everyone from the Spork community to join the MACI round, and the MACI round was to select the winner of the East Denver 2022 hackathon. And there were a lot of people participated in the MACI round, and mostly it was the first time they participated in such a weird thing at that time. But I think people saw the power of these kind of schemes, and later there were other adoptions like OpenSea with Replit. They hosted the hackathon. They adopted MACI on DoraHacks, 0x, they adopted MACI. So there were a handful of communities when they hosted hackathons, they adopted MACI. Then the question is, how can we make sure that everyone could use MACI? And the answer was, okay, can we make MACI available for every community? The complicated part of MACI is that the operator has to run a script, right? So it has to download the Z key, it has to set up the run, deploy the contract, tally the votes, provide the zero-knowledge proof, and verify the proof on-chain, etc., etc. So it's very complicated. So what Dora Vota was doing was that we provided a all-in-one script so that people can just deploy MACI on the UI and do all of the complicated work with one command line. And that's the original version of Dora Vota. So now comes aMACI. So what aMACI is, like the problem aMACI is solving is the trust assumption of MACI, right? So according to my description of MACI, the trust assumption is not unconditional. So people have to rely on the operator, and the operator knows who voted for what. So if the operator colludes with the community, then everyone is sunk. So how do we avoid that? That kind of became a very tough problem, because if we can solve that problem, MACI would be very interesting. If we couldn't, then like the operator could be the single point of failure, and MACI cannot scale. So we started to work on aMACI based on some proposals from some research, and we first implemented aMACI in 2023. We did some like initial testing, and I think this year in March, East Vietnam adopted aMACI for the first time, and there were like more than 100 people tried out, and Vitalik was there. It was very exciting event. So that was like the first adoption of aMACI. But in general, like the most important thing of aMACI is that because of the reduction of trust assumption, aMACI allows that everyone can run an operator for any community. So imagine you're a community, but you don't want to be the operator. In the traditional MACI setting, it's impossible because you cannot trust other people. But in an aMACI setting, because the operator cannot know who voted for what, so the anonymous feature allows the operator to be permissionless, which is super powerful, and that's something we're working on right now.
Very cool. And so, what's the next steps here? What's the roadmap for Dora Vota, and how can people utilize it in their own hackathon or for their own funding?
Yeah, so for aMACI, our implementation was based on a non-MPC implementation. The way how aMACI was anonymous MACI was implemented was we added a few data structures. There is the set called deactivate set, which allows users to deactivate their keys at will. And we make sure that the operator doesn't know who. So like after the activation of the keys, a voter will register a new key. So how anonymous MACI works is that we make sure that the operator doesn't know who deactivated what key and who registered for what new key, and then to the operator, like from the operator's perspective, in the end, it's just like a bunch of random votes from a bunch of random addresses, but he or she doesn't know who actually voted for what. So with that, we use some techniques to do the implementation, and the next step is that we will have a fully automated service, like we can do the operator job, or anyone can do the operator job for all of these communities or hackathons, whoever is using aMACI. And we will make anonymous MACI very simple and very cheap to use. And we believe that it's going to be very helpful to the adoption of anonymous MACI. In fact, the adoption of anonymous MACI will be much easier than the adoption of MACI. So there will be two things that would happen potentially at the same time. So first, there will be integration with DoraHacks. We will add MACI judging to all of the hackathons. It's not mandatory, but like every hackathon organizer could use anonymous MACI as their way of judging. And on the Dora Factory side or on the Dora Vota side, we're going to extend our current Dora Vota tour so that like any type of community or voting round operator can just spin up an aMACI round right away whenever that operator needs to. But that person doesn't have to be the operator, so someone else can be the operator. So that's going to be a very exciting MACI product.
Very exciting. So where can people find you, and how can people get involved? I guess, is everything under the DoraHacks website, or are there other places where people can interact with you?
DoraHacks.io is the platform for developers. So if you're developers, hackers, hackathon organizers, ecosystems, you will find everything there of the features. And DoraFactory.org is the website for Dora Factory. You'll be able to access public good staking as well as Dora Vota and documentations there.
Great, guys. Thanks so much for joining the podcast today, and hope to talk to you soon.
Thank you, Seb.
Yeah, thanks, Seb. Great being on.